In Riyadh, a palace purge with implications well beyond Saudi Arabia's borders. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman cleaning house with the firing and sometimes jailing of royal family insiders who include billionaire businessmen, the former head of the National Guard. Does it signal a shift in policy or little more than a 32-year-old heir cementing power ahead of an ascension to the throne that could come sooner rather than later? This house cleaning happened the same weekend where Lebanon's prime minister surprised even his own camp by announcing his resignation while in Riyadh. All this while Yemeni rebels reached the Saudi capital with a missile. Saudi Arabia's rivalry with Iran, the common thread with those stories, and a crowned prince who's all in for taking on Tehran. What does MBS, as he is known, and his rise signal on that score? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the makeover of the House of Saud. And with us from Madrid, Salman al-Ansari, founder of SAPRAC, the Saudi American Public Relations Affairs Committee. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
From Washington, Joe Macron, policy analyst who is with us as well and has been monitoring events not just in Saudi Arabia, but in the wider region. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Commentator Ardavan Amir Aslani, pleasure as always, sir.
Thank you for having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. 2 years ago, most people had never heard of Mohammed bin Salman. The weekend announcement of an anti-corruption campaign, the detention of 11 Saudi princes, 4 ministers, along with dozens of tycoons and senior officials, part of the chronicle of his meteoric rise. Luke Shrego has more.
Internationally, Mohammed bin Salman was a relative unknown before he became Saudi Arabia's second most powerful figure. However, his meteoric rise stems from 2015, when Salman bin Abdulaziz succeeded his half-brother King Abdullah to the throne on his death. The new King Salman's son would be made the Minister of Defense, the youngest man in the world to hold the position at the age of 29. That same year, Mohammed would be made Deputy Crown Prince too, as he embarked on a military campaign against Houthi rebels in neighbouring Yemen after its president was forced into exile. Little progress was made over the next 2 years, as Saudi Arabia came under international criticism for violating human rights and setting off a major humanitarian crisis. In 2017, King Salman would dismiss the existing crown prince, his nephew Mohammed bin Nayef. It put Mohammed bin Salman in the kingdom's #2 role by royal decree, and he set out to burnish his credentials as a reformer.
We are returning to what we were before, a country of moderate Islam open to all religions and to the world. 70% of Saudis are younger than 30, and we will not waste another 30 years before dealing with extremist or destructive ideas. We will destroy them today, immediately.
Salman would embrace media attention and has unveiled plans not just to help diversify away from Saudi Arabia's reliance on oil exports, but effect both deep social and economic change by 2030.
Salman al-Ansari, were you surprised by this house cleaning that we witnessed over the weekend?
Thank you again for having me. It was actually a very big, remarkable action that has been taken by King Salman and his crown prince. There was no doubt that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, in his interview early this year, he talked about having complete accountability system where he and the government go all the way to combat corruption and to combat all the people who are actually taking advantage of the Saudi economy. So right now we saw it, but I was actually surprised of the level, of the high level of decisions that have been taken, and also of the big names that have been arrested. And honestly, Saudi Arabia is right now moving into having one of its biggest transformation periods in its history. So that's a big thing, and we need to have this kind of leadership that shake the Saudi economy, that shake the institutions in such a way that would make Saudi Arabia to be able to achieve its Vision 2030. It's a very ambitious vision. Saudi Arabia has a lot of potential. Saudi Arabia is considered to be the heart of the Arab and Muslim world. It's the biggest oil exporter and producer in the world. It is in between the most important straits in the world, which is Strait Bab el-Mandeb and Strait of Hormuz and Suez Canal. So we have a lot of weight in Saudi Arabia, and we need to cultivate this. We need to maximize the benefits for the Saudi citizens and for the security of the region. So I can say that the Saudi leadership right now is taking a Thatcher-like economic reforms and L.B. Johnson social reforms. That's a big thing, very remarkable, and we are very hopeful that this will continue. The same momentum should continue.
We'll talk about the long view on this, but first let's talk about some of those the big names that you mentioned, and the biggest one for sure is Alwaleed bin Talal, who Forbes lists as the Middle East's richest man. His $13.6 billion worth of holdings include stakes in ride-sharing firm Lyft, Twitter, Citigroup, Four Seasons Hotels, the Georges V Hotel here in Paris, as well as the Savoy in London. Let me ask you, Joe Macaron, how do you explain the arrest of someone of that stature?
I mean, his family was critical traditionally of the King Salman. There's a need. I mean, if you look at the big picture somehow, he wants to change the way power is transferred inside the family. He wants to also shake the balance of power, which is historically it was the king who was the first among equal. Now he is changing the structure in that sense. So the structure is in the media and the businessmen and the hardline clerics. The issue is he's opening a lot of simultaneous war at home and overseas in a way that it might have a backlash at some point. So, I mean, Walid bin Talal is part of this thing he wants to change, but the issue is he's not reforming the system as a whole. The system is a ruling family system. He's trying to cement power within that system. We are not talking about transparency, about having a popular system. We are talking more, there was a lot of talk in the media, whether it is a Russian style or it's a China style. It's more a Chinese style, but within a ruling family system because there's no party. So we cannot see it beyond the prism of having semantic power within the ruling family. But the issue is also, the last point is, that you cannot have a vision of 2030 while arresting businessmen, while arresting a lot of people, and while going through simultaneous war. I mean, what's happening now, it's a gradual. What happened 2015, 2016, of a lot of accumulated issue, whether the relation with the US, whether the Arab Spring. So it's not a complete surprise. It's just a gradual evolution.
Wait, explain that to us. Why can't you have a Vision 2030 program to diversify the economy while, if we take it at face value, carrying out an anti-corruption probe?
Because it's not, there's no basic that it's an anti-corruption. We don't have arrests. We don't have really a judge who ruled, who know what happened. And it's all within the family. Investors might be now worried about investing. If you have a vision at the same time, you have 3 wars going at the same time, it's a critical. The steps Saudi Arabia is taking is good on social reforms, on the economy, on liberalizing, but you cannot at the same time lead a power struggle and trying to have a vision for the future. There's this inherent contradiction between the two.
All right, Ardavan Amir Aslani, your thoughts on this 32-year-old crown prince? Yes. Is he biting off more than he can chew here? If he's taking on, well, rivals, potential rivals to his own power, but also, as we just heard from Joe, the structure by which the king is a first among equals.
Joe is right when he talks about Saudi Arabia not being a transparent country. And we are looking at a system today that is basically what it has always been, a feudal theocracy. And this 32-year-old prince, what is he doing today? And by the way, Al-Walid is not the most important prince that he put aside. The most important prince is the head of the National Guard, the son of the late King Abdullah, who was himself at one point a contender for the job of crown prince. We are looking at a prince who 2.5 years into his position as the dominant figure in Saudi Arabia has amassed a number of responsibilities. Minister of Defense, a 29-year-old Minister of Defense, head of Economic Development Board, head of the Supervisory Board of Aramco, head of the private department of his father, the king, and now head of the Commission for Transparency and Anti-Corruption. Commission created 2 hours before the arrests were made. What we're listening today is another coup done by King Salman and his favorite son.
Or a consolidation of power.
You can walk around terminology, but that's the reality.
The head of the National Guard, Mehmet Ben Abdallah, people are saying he wasn't going to last forever in that job.
That's not the point. This is a country that forever, up until now, has always gone through its problems amongst family members, amongst people who share the same name. The Crown Prince today, what has he to show for? He has the war in Yemen, 2.5 years of war, 40,000 dead civilians, the greatest humanitarian crisis in the world, the clash with Qatar, which was supposed to end in 3 weeks, and we are God knows in how many months into it, and nothing is changing. And don't forget the continuing postponement of Aramco. He's got nothing to show for. So he was compelled to organize this show a week after, in that same very hotel that these people are being lodged, the Ritz-Carlton, where an international conference was organized for his Vision 2030, allegedly to attract foreign investment. Now, how can you attract foreign investment when you go after Alwaleed, which is the leading international face of Saudi Arabia as far as international business is concerned?
Let me ask you about that. Salman al-Ansari, the arrest of Alwaleed bin Talal, of course, we don't know the charges yet specifically. Is that something that's going to spook investors?
Good question. I think let's just get back to the idea of the corruption and combating corruption. I think pleasing the critics of Saudi Arabia is almost impossible. Let me tell you why. Because before this decision has been taken about combating corruption, most of the critics of Saudi Arabia were saying you cannot achieve Vision 2030 without combating corruption. You cannot do this and that without shaking the institutions. You cannot. And right now we are having them to say, after those arrests and after combating corruption, that they are saying you cannot achieve Vision 2030 while you are putting people in prison. So I don't exactly get it at all. When we go to your question about Alwaleed bin Talal, we don't know yet. None of the Saudi citizens and independent thinkers have any idea of the exact allegations yet. So such things will happen or will be released very soon. So we cannot comment about something that we did not have proof of yet. So I think with regard to the kingdoms moving forward to achieve its vision, to be globally engaged, to open up Aramco to the whole world, and to be the main economic player, not only in the region, but one of the main in the world, since Saudi Arabia is part of the G20 and has a great wealth and also great human resources that can actually take the country to a new level. So we need such social reforms, we need such economic reforms, we need such legal reforms. So if some people would just say, let's go into the intention of the Saudi leadership, why did they do this? And some of them would say to consolidate power, etc. This is baseless and has no proof. And this is actually identical to the Iranian propaganda and the Hezbollah, the terrorist propaganda.
You will agree, Salman, that there is a lot of power concentrated in his hands. And you heard Joe Macron say that this is not the usual modus operandi for a crown prince to basically, create a vacuum around him.
I got your point. It's actually not like that at all, because it's already there. Saudi Arabia is not a democracy. It's not like a democratic country. Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy country where the king has all the power. Do people like it? Do people dislike it? It's irrelevant. What we are talking about is that Saudi Arabia is moving towards its vision, disregarding the critics, disregarding the people who would criticize the way it manages its behaviors. Let's be actually in a position where we clap to Saudi Arabia. Why we should clap to Saudi Arabia? Because it actually cracked down on terrorism. It actually confronted the radical Iranian regime that some people support. And also, it cracked down on Al-Qaeda in Al-Mukalla. It freed Al-Qaeda in Yemen from... It freed Al-Mukalla in Yemen from Al-Qaeda. I didn't see the Western media to be clapping for that. I didn't see them to be actually supporting Saudi Arabia through the media. I can see that there are actually good political support from most of the countries, the sane countries in the world that want actually stability. And Saudi Arabia did not go to Yemen just because it wanted to show power. No, it's all about accepting the legitimate government of Yemen's demand to interfere, to get out the Iranian-backed militias and Al-Qaeda. If some people want to support Al-Qaeda and Al-Houthis and Hezbollah, terrorist militias, it's up to them. But they should be kept and put responsible, and they will be all responsible,
we'll talk
even
more
the
about,
advocates for them.
We'll talk more about Yemen and what's going on with Lebanon in part 2. But let me just, Joe Macaron, in that report we saw at the outset, that profile of the Crown Prince, we heard Mohammed bin Salman talking about a return to what we were before as Saudis. And he talked about returning to a moderate Islam. What did he mean by that?
I mean, this is maybe a message basically of the West. He's taking a distance from the hardline clerics. I'm not sure when before, because the clerics had an alliance, you know, with the ruling family for decades. So he's trying to take a distance. He's trying to appeal to the young guy. He has a populist message. So he's basically trying to, in the name maybe of reform, of distance from the Islamists, to appease the West, he can basically expand his power. So for me, that's the concern now. Because it has a repercussion not only for Saudi Arabia, as you said, it has a regional application, as we'll talk later. So basically, he's at the same time challenging the hardline clerics, the businessmen, the media elite who are against him, and of course the ruling family. And unlike what my colleague said in Madrid, historically or traditionally, it's not an absolute monarchy. You had also wings inside the family that are fighting, but now this family base has so much expanded that it's hard anymore between those many princes to have basically concentration of power. So what Mohammed bin Salman is doing is the natural progress of how things we were expecting to happen, because eventually there'll be some sort of clash. But this doesn't mean we have to clap to Saudi Arabia for Al-Qaeda and the rest, which is good, but this doesn't drive attention from the main issues of reform that should be done not only in Saudi Arabia, across the Arab world, that reforming the system is not necessarily consolidating power, it's changing the way the system is governing.
Changing the way the system is, changing the way it's governed. We're going to pick up on that point. When we come back, we're of course talking about the world's greatest oil producers. Stay with us, you're watching the France 24 debate.
Reporters, presented by Mark Owen.
Villages pillaged and plundered, homes burned to the ground, people tortured and murdered, forced exodus to neighboring Bangladesh. Such has been the plight of the Rohingya in Myanmar for months. Denied citizenship by the government, the Rohingya minority had great hopes in Aung San Suu Kyi's election, but she's done nothing to stop ethnic cleansing. Don't miss this exclusive France 24 report to meet this Muslim ethnic minority.
Reporters on France 24 and France24.com.
French Connections, presented by Florence Villeminot.
They're known for their cuisine and saying hello with a kiss. They only work 35 hours per week, when they're not on strike, that is. How true are these clichés about France? Every week, Florence Villeminot tears apart stereotypes. Join us for insight into French culture and current events to understand what makes the French so unique.
French Connections on France 24 and France24.com.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories we're following for you in the newsroom. The Texas gunman who slaughtered 26 inside a church had sent threatening text messages to his mother-in-law. She was a parishioner there, say authorities. An emergency cabinet meeting in Lebanon after the shock resignation by the Prime Minister. Saud Hariri still in Saudi Arabia. We'll be talking about it in the debate. Donald Trump's Commerce Secretary staunchly denies any wrongdoing in the wake of the Paradise Papers tax avoidance revelations. But Wilbur Ross says he probably will sell his remaining stake in a company tied to Vladimir Putin's inner circle. 2017 on course to be one of the 3 hottest years on record. The UN's warning comes at the opening of the COP23 climate change conference, where the US is represented despite Donald Trump's pullout from the Paris Accord. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're talking about, well, the meteoric rise of MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the 32-year-old crown prince of Saudi Arabia, and the impact it's happening with that purge or anti-corruption crackdown, whatever you want to call it, that took place over the weekend, implicating princes, tycoons, top-ranking officials, and of course there's other developments where he has been front and center regionally. We're talking about in the company of Salman Al-Ansari, founder of SAPRAC, the Saudi American Public Relations Affairs Committee. Welcome back, joining us from Madrid. From Washington, Joe Macaron, who is an independent policy analyst, and here in the studio, commentator Ardavan Amir Aslani. Welcome back to all of you. Just before the break, Joe Macaron, you were talking about, well, the makeup of Saudi Arabia. How far, when we talk about this Vision 2030 plan to diversify the economy, it's an economy based on oil, and that means that you have with it, well, a system whereby you have patronage, which is at the heart of the Saudi economy. Can a country like Saudi Arabia wean itself off of a patronage system?
No, it can't. This is how it ruled over the decades. The problem is if even the oil has to be at least 70 for the Saudi economy to break even next year. He's talking about tax subsidy. This will have impact also on the street. It might have backlash. So the problem, he needs to have a stable political system to be able to advance. But he's been very distracted since he took the crown prince instead of Hanif by this internal domestic power. He's not very focused on foreign policy. We can see in Yemen things are not progressing. So he's very much consumed by this internal struggle. Until he figured it out, it will be hard for him to take the lead. But his priority now is to ascend to power, to consolidate it. If this will happen, we were talking about at least 4 or 5 decades of rule of Mohammed bin Salman. So what's happening now is very tricky in that sense. For him, it's more important than the economy. But yes, I mean, the Saudi has a lot of challenges. The oil is not getting better, the instability of the system, of the region. So there's a need of a structural change, but does it start by jailing up the wealthy and basically maybe all the money concentrated in the ruling family be concentrated in less people instead of more? This will solve the problem. Will you inject the money? We'll have a so there's a lot of question not clear yet because we are all distracted by the internal struggle for power.
And the internal struggle for power, you mentioned there Yemen. There's of course also Lebanon. The surprise resignation of the prime minister, surprise and unprecedented since it was announced from Riyadh. Saud Hariri making his second trip there inside of a week and declaring he tried as long as he could to maintain Lebanon's unity.
Unfortunately, that hasn't prevented Iran from involving itself in internal affairs and contravening our national sovereignty. I have learned through back channels that my life was in danger, and because I want neither to deceive the Lebanese people or back down over my principles, I announce that I am resigning my position as the head of the government.
Ardavan Amir Aslani, the subject of the show is not Lebanon, it's Saudi Arabia. But here it's interesting because we played that clip because you have the Prime Minister of Lebanon announcing his resignation from Riyadh and pointing the finger at Iran.
Of course, we should remember that in compliance with Lebanon's constitutional traditions, you need to have a Sunni Prime Minister. And we should also remember that prior to Hariri being designated prime minister, by the marionette Christian president, the country was devoid of any form of functioning government for 2.5 years. It was threatened by the Islamic Daesh movement on its borders. The economy was in shambles. So his return to the function of prime minister brought stability to Lebanon. Brought stability to Lebanon. Now, today, what are we witnessing? This gentleman from foreign land, and this has so shocked his own fellow countrymen that they're going online saying this is unheard of. They feel abandoned from a foreign country, which is basically his patron country, going out there and resigning from Saudi territory, and the next day, next hour, going over and kissing the Saudi king, basically demonstrates that he was nothing more than the Saudi puppet in charge in Lebanon. He's creating problems over there. In what sense?
And of course, his supporters will answer that Hezbollah is the puppet of Iran.
Hezbollah is in the Lebanese government. Hezbollah ministers were in his government. Hezbollah is part of Lebanon's politics. Now, he had Hezbollah ministers in his government. What has changed ever since? What is the new element over there? Aside from wanting to create a situation, aside from wanting to create a backlash, and this is an encouragement, basically, for Israel to enter into Lebanon and embark upon a war against Hezbollah, and there's a lot of talk about that, and he is behind the story. Now, you're looking at a situation whereby this is not good for Hezbollah. Hezbollah was delighted in the fact that they could maintain stability in the country. Hezbollah was delighted that they could organize a functioning government with a Sunni prime minister who was a pro-Saudi individual. This is not good for Iran. It's not good for Hezbollah. It's good for the Saudi rhetoric that is trying to wreak havoc in the area. It is good for them by finger-pointing at Iran and blaming everything on Iran.
Salman al-Ansari, do you wish that Saud Hariri had not made that announcement from Riyadh?
Actually, it's very important to respond to a point that your honorable guest has mentioned. He avoided saying that Hezbollah is linked to Iran, even though Hassan Nasrallah disagrees with him. And he said publicly, and it's on YouTube, that Hassan Nasrallah gets all the support from the radical Iranian regime. I don't know if he wants to be more of a Hezbollah sympathizer more than Hassan Nasrallah. That's interesting. When it comes to Saud al-Hariri, he came to Saudi Arabia because there was a plot to assassinate him. There were some intelligence reports that have been released by the countries in the region that talked about Saud al-Hariri was in the verge to have a plot against him personally by the Hezbollah militant group, which is a very despicable militant group that cannot be trusted, which is an Iranian agent in Lebanon. And there is a French proverb that you all know. Il n'y a pas de vérité moyenne. There are no half-truths. The only truth about Hezbollah is that it's an Iranian agent that wants to disturb and destroy the Arab world through this militant ideology that does not want no good for the country around it and for the whole world, specifically in Europe and in the United States and everywhere. And we all know how Hezbollah is in the sanctioned list of the United Nations and the U.S. Treasury Department and the U.S. government. So
but my question was, Salman, my question was, are you sorry that he made that statement from Saudi soil as opposed to from his home country?
Actually, if it's going to be for his safety, I would say, no, it's good that he made it in Saudi or any other place other than Lebanon, as long as Hezbollah is still controlling the country in Lebanon. This is not something to be acceptable. And I'm pretty sure that there is a regional and global consensus and agreement to combat all the Iranian-backed militias and their advocates and their promoters and the people who support them, even by words.
Joe Macron, have you made sense of what happened? Why Saud Hariri? Because he even caught his own camp off guard with the announcement of his resignation as prime minister.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to correct a few things, I mean, the Lebanese security forces didn't confirm he was assassinated. The Hezbollah is not on the UN sanction list, and yes, Hezbollah is an Iranian puppet. Just to set the record clear. Now, on the other issue, I mean, something happened on Thursday, November 3rd, that prompted Hariri to leave. His schedule didn't hint any resignation. No, his views. I mean, my personal analysis that it's hard to have one reason for that sense. One of the reasons is maybe he felt there's a big change, power grab in Saudi Arabia, and he was resisting Saudi pressure to basically resign. And he thought like this was the moment maybe to jump on board and basically try to. The second is he and others in Lebanese oligarchy have been worried about the election next May. What will be the outcome? Hariri might lose a little bit of his parliamentary bloc. So he has been worried a lot, and he cannot basically run this election if he's in the government sharing power with Hezbollah. So now he's liberated, he's more able to outcome. And the third part is, it's very clear the Saudi-Iranian challenge. Hezbollah is trying to basically benefit from his so-called victory in Syria and basically try to invest it domestically. And there has been a pressure trying to basically change the balance of power that brought Lebanese President Michel Aoun to power last December or last October. So all this, I think, the Saudi is basically trying to force Iran's hand in Lebanon, maybe in return for something else in Syria. So all this reason, I think, made the change. But obviously, it was not his decision. We don't know the whole story. I don't think he's under house arrest. I don't think there was an assassination attempt against him. But I think this resignation is mostly linked to Saudi domestic politics more than Lebanese domestic politics.
More with Saudi domestic politics.
I'm sorry?
More with Saudi domestic politics than Lebanese,
yes,
you're saying?
I think because all the businessmen that went have the same position like Hariri. Bin Laden, he had his contract taken. He had trouble with his company before. So there was a lot of issue accumulating for Hariri. His company is struggling. He lost his money to invest in Lebanon, to have money for his political career. So now he felt that maybe he was resisting too much, so he wanted to jump on board and to be with Mohammed bin Salman, not in the ranks of the businessmen who were detained. So he was basically thinking more of this interest, more than thinking about the games of Lebanese politics.
Ardavan Amir Islani.
What we are witnessing today from Riyadh is this scenario that is being built, whereby this continuous and rather boring and repetitive Iran pointing is back on the agenda. We all agree that Hariri's resignation had nothing to do with Lebanese politics. Nothing was happening over there aside from this mystical assassination narration that nobody believes in, resigning from a foreign country. When you look at Saudi Arabia, this situation that we have, when substantially important people have been put under house arrest, hundreds of ministers and ex-ministers, this is a coup. And this implies what? This implies that the current Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia does not have the following of other big Saudi princes. That's why he's compelled to push them into silence by putting them out of the economy. The price of oil going down, the war in Yemen basically emptying the coffers of Saudi Arabia, destroying Saudi Arabia's reputation, if there was any reputation internationally speaking, in relation to human rights issues, and the strife in the northeastern part of Saudi Arabia with the Shia issue. All of these are creating problems that are much more important than who's going to rule Saudi Arabia tomorrow. Now, the issue today is that the Saudis are trying to, by finger-pointing constantly at Iran, raise this external threat that supposedly exists in their mind, but the Iranians have a different attitude because they don't feel at war with Saudi Arabia. The Saudis wake up every day finger-pointing at Iran. And the reality is that the problem is not an Iranian problem. When you look at Syria and the end of Daesh, which is a purely Sunni Wahhabi movement, when you look into the Al-Qaeda movement, which is another Sunni Wahhabi movement, all of them finding their ideology exclusively from Saudi Arabia. When the Crown Prince talks about going back to our moderate past, which moderate past? All those that are listening to this conversation know that the retrograde religious school in the Sunni faith is the one that is in alliance with the Saudi royal family. So which moderate path? To the Iraqi prime minister, 8 months ago, before the launch against the Daesh was initiated, he clearly specified that half of all those nationals fighting for Daesh were Saudi nationals. So at the end of the day, this finger-pointing just has one aim: to hide the difficulty that this country is encountering on a daily basis and the huge deficit on leadership that the country has today.
Salman Al-Ansari, your thoughts on what happens next in terms of how you tone it down, how you because relations have not always been bad between Tehran and Riyadh. How do you change this dynamic that we're witnessing, and especially in places like Yemen, where the civilians are bearing the brunt of it.
Yeah, I would love if you can give you some time just to respond to some of the points of your guest, both of them. The first said about the UN sanctioned list that Hezbollah was not there. Let me tell you something. In 2013, the EU, where you guys are right now, put Hezbollah in the sanctioned list, and then the UN followed by putting a lot of the figures and members of Hezbollah in the sanctioned list. You can all check it out. It's in the record. Second thing, about Yemen. Something else. In Yemen, Bab el-Mandeb, which is the Strait of Mandeb, where more than 10% of the world trade goes there, has been liberated from the Houthi militias by the Arab coalition that is led by Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is working for the benefits not only of itself and its region, but the whole world. This is number two. Number three, Al-Qaeda has been kicked out of Al-Mukalla, which is their capital in Hadramaut, in Yemen. Number three, 85% of the Yemeni lands have been liberated and got back to be in the hands of the legitimate government. So it's a successful war so far. Number four, when it comes to what your guest has mentioned, like seriously, we cannot understand how people want to mix apples with oranges. I am very surprised that he mentioned Al-Qaeda ties to Saudi Arabia. He should have mentioned it like the other critics a week ago, but not after the 470,000 documents that have been released just lately by the CIA that put all the proofs of the Osama bin Laden's links to Iran and also Qatar, the one that he was defending as well. So let's be very clear here. After the summit of the Riyadh summit, where more than 55 Muslim leaders met with the President of the United States, they made it so clear. There is no gray area on combating terrorism. It's either black or white. If you want to be in the club of combating terrorism, join us. If you don't, then face the consequences, and that's what will happen to the radical Iranian regimes and its militias, either Houthis or Hezbollah or all the supporters.
On that score, Salman, I'm sorry, on that score, let me ask you, what was your reaction to that recent speech in London by Israel's Prime Minister signaling a closening of relations with Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, there is no official thing that happened so far from the Saudi part. Some people would say that there is some sort of reapproachment between Saudi and Israel. I don't see it. I would love definitely to see a peaceful solution for the Israeli-Palestinian issue that would go back to the main Arab demands to grant the Palestinians their rights to exist and their right to have their own country. And I'm pretty sure that the whole region is moving towards a direction through which we can have a real solution for the Palestinian crisis. And guess what? One of the main obstacles of finding a solution in Palestine was actually the radical Iranian regime and their support of terrorists in Palestine itself.
Also in Catalonia.
Trying to have it, and by trying it, don't mix apples with orange, please. By trying it, to have it under their umbrella, which is something cannot be accepted. And I'm very sure, and I'm very actually happy and content that there is this kind of movement of looking to get all the countries to get together to fight extremism and to fight all the terrorist militias that are supported by the radical Iranian regimes, also Al-Qaeda and Daesh, because we all know that Saudi Arabia has been attacked more than 30 times by ISIS last year.
Joe Macron, let me ask you, the alliances are shifting in the region. Your thoughts, this closening of ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia, it's basically an anti-Iran coalition.
I mean, yes, indirectly, there's the big shift, I think, was in Washington. That basically is paving the way for all this to happen in the region, including inside Saudi Arabia. So you have a President Trump, who wants to return to traditional allies. They don't have to be working together, but basically you are seeing a U.S. And Saudi, Israeli, and basically on the other side you have the
And
Russian,
some even argue that his
Iranian.
interests, Donald Trump's interests, are closer to that of Saudi Arabia than to that of Israel.
He is, but I think the tricky part for Saudi Arabia in this instance is they are getting close to Trump, to a small circle around Trump. But the U.S. establishment in general, whether the Pentagon or State Department, have different view, and they are not necessarily aligned with Saudi interests at this point of time. So it has to be a little bit, because Trump, there's a risk about him staying in the power on the medium term or on the long term. It might not happen, but the issue is they are basically bypassing other U.S. interests in that sense. But yes, I mean, the problem in Lebanon, if you go out of Lebanon, there's a risk that giving it a little bit to Russia, a little bit to Iran. So the U.S. is worried. So now they're going to engage Lebanon and not basically allow it to slip away. Iraq is the same. So you have engagement in Iraq and basically a withdrawal and a challenge in Lebanon. So it doesn't make sense for the regional strategy. And in Saudi Arabia, you have a total withdrawal of Saudi Arabia. And even in the U.S., they have no plan. And you cannot have challenging policy in Lebanon if you don't have a clear policy in Syria. So the problem is it's all driven by domestic interest, not by a clear policy. You have the president calling the Saudi king on the day of the big changes in the region, and he's talking to him about Aramco and the US stock exchange, not even mentioning the issue of need for stability in the region, the need of, to deter Iran or something else. But this was his priority. So the issue is, the big shift, I think, is in Washington and the lack of clear vision and the differences in policies here.
All right, look at Washington to understand what's going on sometimes in the Middle East. Joe Macron, we're going to leave it there. I want to thank you so much for joining us from the U.S. Capitol. I want to thank as well Salman Al-Ansari for being with us from Madrid, and Ardavan Amir Aslani. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois.
Plenty of palace intrigue.
Oh, absolutely. Let's take a look at some of the headlines across the world's media on this. So we have Bloomberg.com with a somewhat factual reading of things. You could say, well, leaving out a lot of the facts, it's just presenting it as a corruption purge, if you like. Saudi Arabia begins freezing bank accounts of corruption suspects. But really, most of the headlines are mentioning, as you say, the palace intrigue, Francois. Game of Thrones, that's one that's coming back in headlines quite a bit. The New York Times publishing that article just a little while ago, kind of summing up all of the different, everything that's at stake in what's playing out in the region. We're even hearing of Game of Thobes, and Thobe being a word for the gown that is worn by, for example, the prince in this particular case. Now, this is Al Jazeera's website. Worth pointing out, of course, that Al Jazeera was threatened with being...
Not the favoured medium of the Saudi...
Not really, and you can get that coming through in Jamal El-Shayal's reading of things here as well. Of course, famously, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain were putting a lot of pressure on Qatar to shut Al Jazeera down. Now, his reading of things here is, this is the Saudi version of Game of Thobes. The 32-year-old Prince bin Salman shows he is willing to throw the entire region into jeopardy to wear the royal gown. He speaks of Yemen no longer being, you could never no longer refer to it as a functioning state. Egypt is a ticking time bomb, and now Lebanon may erupt. Lebanon also coming back in this headline in the Express. In the UK, they even talk about World War III, but bearing in mind this is the Express, they tend to do headlines like Donald Trump does tweets, lots of all caps and lots of sensationalism. You have down here France in all caps, chaos, right? So that perhaps should be taken into account. Now, right?
Roll that back again.
Okay, World War III.
France and chaos, okay.
It's not very zen, you know. You'd need to have a nice
it's loud.
yogi tea or something while you're reading the Express. What the royal purge means for Saudi Arabia and its oil. This is just published about an hour ago by the Washington Post. They say the kingdom is at a crossroads. They speak to Bruce Rydell of the Brookings Institution, and he says the economy is flatlined with low oil prices. The war in Yemen is a quagmire. The blockade of Qatar is a failure. Iranian influence is rampant in Lebanon, Syria and Iraq. The succession is a question mark, he says. It's the most volatile period in Saudi history in 50 years.
By the way, price of oil, it's hit a 2-year high this Monday.
You should see the price of oil within 2 years from now. The American shale oil revolution. America is producing more oil today than Saudi Arabia. the operation of Brazilian deep sea drilling. All of these will have as an immediate consequence a decline in the price of oil. That's what all the experts are going to say. The IMF has mentioned on several occasions that Saudi Arabia is going to go totally bankrupt if they didn't get their act together.
So there's lots. I mean, no matter what angle on the story you focus on, whether it be the oil prices or the repercussion on the surrounding region, there's always a lot to say on it. Saudi, of course, many people commenting on the death of Saudi Prince Mansour bin Mukrin, who in a helicopter crash in Asir province. He wasn't the only person who died. There were 8 people who died in that crash. And the timing has escaped no one's attention. I suppose death comes amid royal family power play, says the ABC's news website in a sub-headline. On social media as well, a lot of people making sarcastic comments about the timing of that death. Of course, it could be a total coincidence or maybe not, but it's certainly drawing comment on social media. Saudi coup is another hashtag that's being used on social media, picking up on headlines such as this headline in the Financial Times, a family coup in Saudi Arabia. So family coup, family or purge, Game of Thrones, Game of Thobes. You can see the tone of the headlines here. One, I suppose, more interesting comment here on social media. This is a tweet by Vali Nasser, who is the dean of Johns Hopkins SAIS School in Washington, so he says Saudi Arabia is becoming a modernizing, autocratic monarchy like the Shahs in Iran. So he's speaking somewhat in more positive tones about an attempt to modernize, I guess, but then he makes this reference to Iran under the Shah, and he says the irony is that Iran would be confronting its own past. So that's quite a dense little tweet there. I thought I'd throw it in.
Put a lot into 140 characters.
He certainly did.
And we finished on Donald Trump. Donald Trump is coming up. He's bleeding into this conversation as well.
He is. And I'll just finish with one image because we could talk about Donald quite a bit. You remember his trip to Saudi Arabia and all of the massive amount of satire that went up on social media after they all, this was Donald Trump and on his trip to Saudi touching this orb. And it's actually the world. They're all holding the world. You know, there's a lot of symbolism in that. You can read much into it if you want. But people were turning it into these crazy sort of cartoons and GIFs and whatever. People got very creative with it. And now it's back. The orb is back. And some people saying this is all down to the orb. I think it's a bit more complicated than that, but it's a nice image.
All right. We'll finish on a little bit of superstition.
There you go.
James Green, many thanks. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.